You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, we've got a big, unprecedented win for Jack Smith over Mike Pence here. What happened, and how big is this for the special counsel?
So the newly sworn in chief judge of federal district court in Washington, D.C., Judge Boasberg, just ruled that Mike Pence must go into the grand jury that's investigating the crimes of Donald Trump and testify about, in a very real sense, testify against Donald Trump. And given that Mike Pence has some of the most directly incriminating information and evidence, not only about Donald Trump's conduct, but Donald Trump's criminal intent, this is a pretty significant blow to the Trump camp.
Now, Pence tried to claim that he was protected from testifying because of the speech and debate clause. You and I have spoken about that. That was as big a stretch as you could find, considering the speech and debate clause is meant to protect legislators who are debating over actual legislation. Pence has a ceremonial role, or had a ceremonial role, as the president of the Senate. The chief judge ruled that while Pence does have some limited protections, that immunity doesn't prevent him from testifying about conversations related to the illegal activity on Trump's part. So what part of this did Pence win?
So this is really interesting. Now, of course, we don't have the judge's ruling yet. It has not been made public because it's a grand jury matter. It will remain secret until there's some reason for the judge to issue it publicly. So, there are some good investigative journalists at work sort of talking to sources. And I don't know if it's so much that Pence won anything. I actually read this as Judge Boasberg doing the really smart thing. And here's why. So what Boasberg reportedly ruled is that Pence has to testify about all of Donald Trump's criminal activity, his statements, his attempt to pressure Pence into basically corruptly throwing him the election on January 6th. But it looks like the judge said, but you know what? With respect to what you actually did on January 6th, when you were presiding over the Senate for purposes of counting the electoral college votes, you don't have to testify about that. And we don't yet know if Judge Boasberg entered that ruling, that very limited protection of Pence, because he thinks the speech or debate clause might apply. This is uncharted water.
Yeah.
So it feels to me like the judge was sidestepping that issue, was saying, you know what? Everybody knows what Mike Pence did on January 6th. For gosh sakes, it's on tape, right? We saw him during the Capitol attack, fleeing the Capitol. It's not really that important for him to testify about what he did on January 6th. So Boasberg, by saying, you know what, former Vice President Pence, you don't have to testify about that, it's essentially taking away an issue that Pence could otherwise appeal,
Right.
maybe all the way up to the Supreme Court. He basically kind of mooted it out, took it off the table and said, okay, Mike, you don't have to testify about that. But what you do have to testify about is all of Donald Trump's crimes and his pressure campaign on you. And frankly, that's the meat of the incriminating evidence that Jack Smith wants and needs. So if you call it a partial victory for Pence, it's a really hollow partial victory.
Yeah, I mean that was going to be my next question is what in the not illegal part would the grand jury or would prosecutors be interested in? I mean, isn't the only part that's actually interesting for the investigators the part where the illegality was at play here? I mean, like
Precisely. It's the part that is certainly most important to any criminal charges that are going to be brought against Donald Trump. But you can imagine the grand jurors would probably be keenly interested in having Mike Pence recount what he had to endure on January 6th at the Capitol. I mean, we have all seen now
right.
that once Donald Trump tweeted out, Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what he needed to do. We saw the time-lapsed photography at that moment, because at that moment is when Donald Trump's angry mob stormed the Capitol. Talk about cause and effect. I think the grand jury would love to hear from Mike Pence's perspective what in the world he went through, but I don't think that is necessary for purposes of collecting up all of the incriminating information about Donald Trump.
And by the way, that's why those January 6th committee hearings were so important, because even though we won't have any insight into that stuff, if it is protected under speech and debate, we already know because we watched these primetime hearings where we basically had a minute by minute recount of what was happening thanks to Trump's incitements to violence. Glenn, what specifically can Mike Pence give to Jack Smith here that could hurt Donald Trump?
So, the two things that any prosecutor has to prove if you're going to charge somebody with a crime is that there was a criminal act and there was criminal intent. The beauty of Mike Pence being compelled to testify in the grand jury is he can provide direct evidence of both. There were a number of one-on-one meetings that, frankly, I don't think we've heard any evidence of between Donald Trump and Mike Pence. We've heard a smattering of it. Some of the names Donald Trump was calling Mike Pence because, he wouldn't do Trump's corrupt bidding, trying to, withhold or retain the power of the presidency unlawfully and unconstitutionally. But what's going to be most important in a future trial is for Mike Pence to be sitting on a witness stand, placed under oath, and asked about what Donald Trump said to you about how you should refuse to certify the results of Joe Biden's win. You should block those results, or you should delay those results so you could kick it back to the states and Donald Trump's other nefarious plan can be put in place. So all of this coming out of the mouth of Mike Pence, when he can say, Donald Trump told me to do X, Y, and Z, you're providing powerful evidence, sharply incriminating evidence of both Donald Trump's conduct and Donald Trump's intent.
Jack Smith issued the subpoena to Mike Pence in February. Pence has vowed to fight it. He said, quote, "No vice president has ever been subject to a subpoena to testify about the president with whom they served." How does someone like Mike Pence, or these other Republicans more broadly, these Trump world officials, how do they not get that pointing to the unprecedentedness of all of this is not like the argument that they think it is, considering no president has ever committed a crime that has caused them to need to investigate this kind of stuff? Like, yeah, dude, it's unprecedented. Guess what else is unprecedented? The fucking crime that led to this.
Yeah. The fact that they keep pulling that out of their, let's go with hat and say, well, it's so unprecedented. That should land to the listener as a condemnation of Donald Trump.
Right.
It's unprecedented that you have to have a vice president testify in a grand jury about the democracy busting crimes of a president of the United States, because no other president of the United States would ever dream of doing what Donald Trump did. So yes, unprecedented. Every time they use that word, you should hear that as a condemnation of Donald Trump.
Perfectly put. Pence is about as close to Donald Trump as you can get. He served as his vice president. Does this signal that this case is nearing its end, since we're kind of at the top of the food chain here?
I don't know if these investigations will ever, approach, the end.
Yeah.
It seems like we've been waiting for justice forever. I am not prepared to say that just because, Mike Pence, one of the most important incriminating witnesses against Donald Trump, has now been ordered to testify, that we're near the end game and we're going to see indictments in the coming weeks. Now, don't forget, Mike Pence is going to have an opportunity to appeal this. We'll see if he does or not. So look at what the appellate court has done recently, right? In other litigation, when issues were appealed, they gave Donald Trump 6 hours until midnight to file his complaints. And then they gave Jack Smith until 6 a.m., 6 hours later. And then that day they resolved the issue, and they resolved it against Donald Trump, ordering a whole bunch of other officials to testify. So I think that bodes well, because it looks like maybe the federal judiciary is done letting Donald Trump and his lackeys weaponize the delay that is ordinarily built in to the appellate process. You know what? Mike Pence wants to appeal it. Let him appeal it. The appellate court will reject his claim, and I predict the Supreme Court won't even want to hear his claim. So I feel like even if we're not nearing the end game, we are at least accelerating.
Now, I know that Pence has the opportunity to appeal if he wants to. Can Donald Trump appeal this decision on Pence's behalf because it's regarding him?
So, Brian, you may have just stumped the lawyer. That should be our new segment here in the Legal Breakdown. Stump the lawyer. I think you just succeeded.
All right.
So there's this thing called standing, right? If you don't have standing, which loosely translated means, do you have a dog in the legal fight? If you don't have standing, then ordinarily you can't appeal. But, because these are unprecedented, let's hear that as, Donald Trump is at fault here. Because these are unprecedented circumstances, it may very well be that when Judge Boasberg rejected Donald Trump's executive privilege claim, trying to, keep a lid on Mike Pence's testimony, it may very well be that he could file an appeal. It wouldn't shock me if the appellate court was willing to listen to that appeal, but then reject it promptly, because really the whole executive privilege game that Donald Trump has been playing was resolved back in 1974 in Richard Nixon Watergate days, when they said, executive privilege will yield when you are in the grand jury criminally investigating the potential crimes of a president. That is not what executive privilege was designed to hide, to bury, to secrete.
Yeah. Let's finish off with this on the Pence stuff, and that is that can Pence still invoke the Fifth to keep from having to testify if and when he ultimately does have to go in to testify?
That's a great question, because it looks like Jack Smith is winning battle after battle after battle. He won the executive privilege battle. He kind of sidestepped the speech or debate clause battle, but in substance, he won because he's going to get all the testimony out of Pence that he needs. However, Mike Pence can still walk into the grand jury. And if Mike Pence's truthful testimony would incriminate him, would make it seem like he committed a crime, he can absolutely plead the Fifth. He can invoke his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Then the game gets even more interesting, because then Jack Smith has a couple of options. One, if Mike Pence doesn't actually have a viable Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, maybe he's just trying to throw it up to stonewall Jack Smith, well, then they can go right back in front of Chief Judge Boasberg and they can litigate whether Mike Pence has a valid Fifth Amendment privilege to invoke. I have had judges, not infrequently, rule that a witness who tried to plead the Fifth really didn't have a Fifth to plead, so they could be ordered to testify. But let's assume Mike Pence did commit a whole bunch of crimes in concert with Donald Trump. He would have a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination under those circumstances. Then Jack Smith can immunize him, because immunity extinguishes your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, because the government cannot use your statements against you. So he could give him immunity, compel him to testify, and then that would make it very, very difficult for Jack Smith ever to prosecute Mike Pence for any crimes he may have committed after you immunize him. But here is the other thing Jack Smith could do. If Mike Pence pleads the Fifth, and it is a well-placed Fifth because Mike Pence committed crimes, Jack Smith could charge him as a co-defendant and then seek to flip him against Donald Trump. So, the game is clearly still afoot. There's still a lot of tactical maneuvering that needs to go on. And it's anybody's guess as to whether Mike Pence finally gives up the ghost, testifies about Donald Trump's crimes, or continues to pull out all the stops and, in a very real sense, continues to try to hide the evidence of Donald Trump's crimes.
Okay, I want to switch over to the Manhattan DA case just for a quick moment, and that is just to ask, what do you imagine the deal is right now? Because I know that our thoughts on this case were colored by the fact that Trump posted on Truth Social that his arrest was imminent, that it was coming last Tuesday. That obviously didn't happen. So what would you explain the wait is if the grand jury is meeting, which reporting suggests that they are?
So now it's becoming a little bit of a head scratcher, Brian, because once we learned that the district attorney had invited Donald Trump to testify, that's usually the last base we prosecutors touch in a grand jury investigation before we ask the grand jury to vote on charges, to return an indictment. I thought that was a sure sign that they were at the end game. They also put Michael Cohen before the grand jury at about the same time, probably the single most important witness. We were all kind of feeling like, okay, it looks like Alvin Bragg, the New York district attorney, is wrapping things up. We could see an indictment soon. But what did we just see? We saw another witness go before the grand jury, a guy named David Pecker, the head of the National Enquirer tabloid magazine, the guy who was involved in these catch and kill operations. Anytime, somebody was about to expose Donald Trump's, misconduct, David Pecker from the National Enquirer would catch the story, would pay off the person, to have an exclusive, in other words, to kill the story, to bury the story. And we learned that David Pecker was the one who introduced Stormy Daniels' lawyers, Stormy Daniels' team, to Michael Cohen which then resulted in the illegal hush money payment that Bragg has been investigating. Why David Pecker just went into the grand jury when we have all known literally for years that David Pecker played this pivotal role in the Stormy Daniels saga, that leaves me scratching my head thinking, okay, at what stage of the investigation is Alvin Bragg right now? So I just think we all have to sit back. We have to let Alvin Bragg do his thing. And you know what? The indictment will come when the indictment comes. But boy, sitting back and remaining patient as Donald Trump threatens Alvin Bragg, saying things like there will be death and destruction if I'm indicted, and posting a picture with, Donald Trump appearing to swing a baseball bat right at Alvin Bragg in, the adjacent picture. These things are dangerous. These things are criminal. That constitutes the crime of interfering with a government official by trying to intimidate him in his official duties. It's hard to sit back and wait, but at this point, I think that's all we can do.
Yeah, and I think the irony of this is that we are kind of seeing the consequence of this very delayed justice in real time. Because the only reason that Donald Trump is so emboldened to continue attacking Alvin Bragg and trying to intimidate him and intimidate other law enforcement officials is because nothing is happening. So it's kind of like this vicious cycle where nothing happens, and then Trump gets emboldened to do it more, and we continue not to see him held to account for what he's done, and on it goes. So with that said, we will hopefully see something soon, and as soon as something does break, we'll continue to cover it here. So if you want to keep up with legal news, make sure to follow both of our channels. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.